You open this door with the key of reason. Beyond it is another dimension, a dimension of truth, a dimension of freedom, a dimension of joy. You're moving into the land of both the ideal and the real, of the possible and the actual. You've just crossed over into the capitalist corner.
Where reason meets reality, welcome to the capitalist corner.
Hey folks, where reason meets reality, welcome to your island of reason in a sea of irrationality. We are the Capitalist Corner. I am your host, Mark Pellegrino, and also the chairman of the American Capitalist Party, along with my co-host and vice chair of the American Capitalist Party, Michael Leibowitz, who is also the host of a multiplicity of shows, so many shows now that I have trouble keeping track of them. So, Michael, can you please...
That's because you're a boomer. That's a memory issue.
No, I'm not a boomer. I'm boomer adjacent. But if you can please list the shows the number of amazing things that you're bringing to the world right now, I would appreciate it.
Listen, if the topic of the COVID lockdowns, which was momentous in our history, still interests you, I have a great interview with epidemiologist Newt Witkowski. It's up there right now on the Rational Egoist. I highly recommend it to everyone. Very, very bright guy, multiple PhDs, intelligence way out there. But we also have this. I've got Everyday Ethics coming up today at 2:30. We got Self-Made Soul on the weekends. We're kicking ass. We're taking names. But we have a great economist on the show today. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get right to the nitty gritty with the economist.
Amen.
All right. So given that I'm more of an expert, no, I'm only kidding. Okay. So Vance, you wrote an article, I believe in August, about the OECD's projection of slowed economic growth. Now, that would seem on the surface to be contradicted by the latest quarterly numbers, which had economic growth above 3.5%. What's going on? I mean, explain what the projection was based on and then what this whole thing is based on here.
Yeah. So great to be with y'all today. The third quarter GDP numbers, the latest numbers we have out was 4.3%. So that's pretty rapid growth, well above what the OECD and others were forecasting for the United States. So in their calculations, OECD and some others who put out these forecasts, they were looking at, okay, what's going on with tariffs? What's going on with the protectionism at the federal level, especially by the Trump administration, and some of these other economic factors, and saying, look, this is going to slow down economic growth, so we're not going to have much growth. And so these numbers indicate, well, we have a lot more growth than what they were expecting, almost twice as fast as what they were expecting at that 4.3% on an annual basis. And so I think that
oh, you're freezing up on us, Vance.
Will make us question not only the forecast coming out, but what is the... And those two are things that, you know, they rive up the economy. They keep the economy going for a little while. But if we don't get more investment has actually been declining, was up only 0.2% in GDP growth in the third quarter. If investment doesn't happen, then we don't have future supply and future economic growth. And so there's a little bit of both in here, I would argue, is that, yes, growth was faster than many forecasts, but at the same time, there are weaknesses that are out there given the amount of protectionism and other sort of factors in the economy.
So what do you anticipate over the next year in regard to this? I know prediction is very tough in economics, but given what you know.
Yeah. I mean, you know, looking at this as an economist, I'm always looking at behavior and how people are behaving and what's going on. And so what I've been seeing here a lot this year is the amount of economic uncertainty, especially when I talk to a lot of businesses, given they don't know what their supply chains are going to be with all the tariffs and other things that are going on. And that has slowed down economic growth, that investment that I talked about, along with job creation. We had new jobs numbers that came out today for the month of December to finalize all of 2025. And what we saw is that when that Liberation Day tariff started in April, after that, job growth was essentially flat. There wasn't much job growth over that period of time. And so what I'm hoping is in 2026 that we're in now is that there will be a couple things. One is I hope that they can get their fiscal house in order at the federal level. That will help to reduce the uncertainty in the economy when you think about the excessive spending and deficits, but also the trade protectionism. and the tariffs and the on again, off again sort of situation the Trump administration has put us in over the last year, if that goes away, then I think we'll see a lot more economic growth. However, if it stays in place, I think you'll continue to see more of this. We'll have some green shoots here and there with more growth. Then we'll have some slowdown, just on again, off again, because of the uncertainty that's out there. That's kind of where my thinking is right now. We'll see what happens, but that's where I'm at right now.
But do you think that Trump screwing with the Fed and interest rates he's going to try to mask some of the effects of the slowdown? And do you think that's a possibility? He could tout big numbers with the stock exchange, lots of spending and consumer activity because of the lower interest rates, and use that as an excuse to continue the policies that he's doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth to that for sure. If you think about the monetary policy that's been going on now, they lowered interest rates 3 times the target interest rate by the Fed last year. So we're down to 3.5% now is where they're at. And what that does is it incentivizes hopefully more investment, more loans, right? You don't have to pay as much, so people can take loans and consume new cars and other things that are out there. So that will help to speed up the economy. There's also, there were some good pro-growth things that were in the one big beautiful bill is what they like to call it, right? When you look at full expensing, meaning that if a business wants to go out and buy a new infrastructure or a new tractor or something else, instead of depreciating it over time and reducing your tax liability that way, they could do it that year. And so that also incentivizes more growth that I think we'll see more in 2026 than otherwise. So between the Fed's action and the one big beautiful bill, that could allow for more growth. But the problem here is, will it be long-term growth? And that's something that I'm still, concerned about when looking at the economic picture, given that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is still $6.5 trillion. And we can go into detail about that. We're running $2 trillion a year in deficits. And so you still have all these economic hindrances to economic growth.
Vance, what initially brought you onto our radar is we covered your article on this show, and then I interviewed you about it, is you wrote an article called Econ 101, A Compass for a Lost Country. You can't go through all 20 of them, but what main economic ideas do you think most people are just missing or don't get?
There's a lot to that. And that was a great discussion that we had previously. I think the main thing is that people and the economy is not some figment of our imagination, right? The economy are people. And so when you try to distort the economy, we have to think about what the trade-offs are. Like Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And too often people look at what's on the surface level and they'll say, okay, that's good. These tariffs are good. These other things the shutdown may be good. And I think that could be a good thing overall. But you have to look at what the trade-offs are. What are the opportunity costs? What are we going to give up? And that's something that I think in economics, as an economist, that we need to do a better job of explaining to people and helping people understand that there are trade-offs with every decision. Nothing is free. And so all this stuff that's kind of pomp and circumstance out there in the news about how great things are, when you talk to real people that are on the ground right now, what I hear is that there's this affordability issue that's going on, which didn't just start under Trump, okay? That started under the Biden administration. And you could even talk about the COVID lockdowns under the first Trump administration and all that stuff. But I think my main point that I'm trying to get across on this Econ 101 series that I've been doing on my Let People Prosper podcast and on my newsletter is to say, let's start thinking about, for one, people are people and they act rationally and they act in their best interest. That also helps people around them. And that's not only with trade, voluntary trade here in the United States, but also amongst people in other countries. As they're improving their lives, it's also going to improve our lives in the process. And understanding this mutual benefit of a win-win scenario from voluntary exchanges versus this zero-sum sort of fallacy that many are pushing out there and populists are putting out there, I think is really hurting our economic literacy, and something that I hope we can get back to understanding that that voluntary trade is important and it does allow for us to be more prosperous.
Were we ever in a position, I mean, where people understood trade as a win-win proposition? I mean, I first heard it from Ayn Rand many years ago, but I didn't know that was really mainstream.
Well, I mean, look, Adam Smith, right? Way back, 1776, we're actually celebrating 250 years this year of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, along with our independence here in America. And at that time, they talked a lot about absolute advantage. And so he was trying to overturn what they discussed from mercantilists, where before that, mercantilists basically said that we need as much gold inflow as possible, that it's all trade, or at least foreign trade, is a win-lose situation. It's a zero-sum game, so we need as much gold as possible. And he said, look, what you really want to focus on is the advantages that people have of allowing for them to produce more in one place versus the other, and allow for those trades to then improve the overall prosperity, expand the economic pie, if you will, of economic growth. And that allows for division of labor and specialization. And then you get into David Ricardo back in the 1800s that talked about comparative advantage. And I think during periods of time, especially during the 20th century, the 1900s, there was a big push to having free trade. I mean, if you think about it, look at Bill Clinton signed, or at least helped to get NAFTA really get going after it was put into law. And so there was a push to more freer trade. Now, if you talked about at the margins, there were certainly people who were like, well, we need more fair trade and we need this, that, and another, or help this particular sector or industry, which I would rather them not do. But I do think that there was a period of free trade is beneficial for everyone. And now the idea, and Trump, I think, popularized this even more, was to say, no, it's not a win-win. It's a win-lose situation. And we are going to be better off if we're winning, right? If quote unquote we're winning and other people are losing. So I would argue that this has been more of a recent phenomenon of how opposed that people are to these win-win situations.
Have you seen the news that Trump is going to take, I think, $200 or $250 billion from Fannie and Freddie and invest it in the housing market to drive down interest rates? Is that as bad as I think it is?
Yes, it is bad. It's just another way of government planning. It's an industrial policy in this sense of trying to put more money into the housing market and allow for interest rates to go down, is what they're trying to do with that. Manipulate the interest rate, because Trump is arguing the mortgage rates are too high, that people aren't going to go out and buy it. A lot of people like myself got a mortgage back in 2020 or 2021 when interest rates were like 2.5%, 3%. Now you have to go out and get 6.5%, 7%. So your monthly payments will double given those sort of situations, or you can't even afford it. I don't even know if I could afford my house right now if I had to pay the same interest rates that are out there on the market today. And so there's this incentive, I think, that Trump wants to put in place to say, let's use Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are basically government entities, government-sponsored enterprises now, and use this $200 billion of excess cash that they have on their balance sheet, which I don't know why they have excess cash to begin with. They should use that to reduce the deficit. Instead of trying to put more money towards these mortgage rates and buy mortgage-backed securities, essentially what they would do to try to bring down those interest rates. But Michael, I mean, the Federal Reserve still has $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities on its balance sheet out of the $6.5 trillion. So if we were going to manipulate interest rates even more, we're going to put us in a worse situation. I mean, I think this is where the Austrian School of Economics is so helpful, because it talks about the production process. When you manipulate one part of that production process, it then filters through and kind of a trickle down throughout the rest of the production process and makes the prices and the signals that are out there all distorted. It makes the situation worse. So we might get a boost in one-time housing affordability, if you will, making it a little bit cheaper, but longer term, those interest rates are going to be much higher. People are going to be buying homes that they otherwise can't afford. And we're going to be putting ourselves in a situation like we did during the 2000s when many people couldn't afford their home anymore. And then that led to the great financial crisis. And so I think this is a terrible move. And instead, they should be working towards removing obstacles created by government of zoning restrictions, of lot limit minimums, lot size minimums, I should say, and those sort of things to expand the supply versus looking at the demand. And so I think this is a terrible move that will put us in the wrong direction. And by the way, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should not be government-sponsored enterprises. They should be privatized like they were before. Now, there was always this implicit backing that the government taxpayers would pay for them if they needed to be bailed out. But those should be private entities. There's no reason the government should have that much influence in the housing market, because at the end of the day, the government's the problem with the housing market, like many things in our economy. So this is just going to make it worse.
When you brought up the structure of production, I was going to drag in Hayekian triangles, but I'll spare everybody that. But the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, which you referenced, which was originated by Mises and Hayek, talks about how, but in general, if you push down interest rates, it alters the structure of production in a way that's not dictated by the supply and demand in the market or by the time preference in the market. But this isn't a general interest rate thing. This is taking money specifically and directing it toward the housing market. But I'm wondering, well, could that create a boom bust that's in the housing market alone? Could the distortions trickle out into other sectors? Like, what can we expect to see with a distortion of that one interest rate rather than general interest rate?
Yeah, if you think about it, so let's say they're able to lower the interest rate, and it's debatable whether that could happen, because if the government's using that $200 billion to put into mortgages, that just means that it's crowding out how much the private sector would also be putting into mortgages. So I'm not sure how much of an effect it will actually have at the end of the day. But let's say that it lowered the average rate from, 6% down to 5%, right? So that could incentivize people to go out and buy more homes, get a mortgage right and buy more homes. So that could incentivize the construction industry for a while if people buy new homes. And then that could expand the economy for a while. But why did those construction jobs exist? Is it a long-term thing or a short-term thing? And I would argue, and I think the Austrian school would too, that this would be short-term. And so you would get that boom, but then you would get the bust. Because at some point, that $200 billion, even though it may have a short-term effect on the interest rate, it's not going to have a long-term effect unless they want to keep using hundreds of billions of dollars to pump into the mortgage industry. And so I really would caution the Trump administration. And look, I worked in the first Trump administration and talked to some of those folks still. It's just they're heading much more into an industrial policy, government planning sort of direction that is not good for the housing market and not good for Americans.
Now, so what they should do is deregulate the housing industry and let prices and interest rates reflect, the capital and the supply and demand ratios and stuff. Now, if they did that, we would see more housing, would we not? We would. Now, it might be more expensive for a while because the prices would reflect supply relative to demand, but those prices would fall precipitously as entrepreneurs came in and started building. They would be responding to those price signals. And unfortunately, the government dislocates that, gives misinformation to the industry, and they can't respond effectively to supply this demand. Why is it so difficult for people to understand this? Why don't they like the temporary shock of a high price, even if they know in the long term it's going to attract innovation into that industry and bring prices lower?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think it's a lot more of the rent seeking, right? Is that it's election year? There's this affordability issue that's going on. Trump wants to deal with it in some capacity. And I think people in the administration feel like this would be a way to do that, at least on the surface. And it could actually get them through the elections to where things look cheaper for a while. And then it comes back up next year. That's one of the problems, right? With folks like us who believe that it does affect the orders of production. It doesn't do it. It doesn't always do it in a short amount of time. And we don't know exactly how much time that's going to be. And so that could be an issue there. Well, one thing though, Mark, that you brought up is about this deregulation. And there's some good examples of this. One is in Austin. I live near Austin, Texas, in Round Rock, just north of Austin. And Austin, of all places, a blue city in a sea of red. There's a few of those in Texas. They actually did some deregulation, some zoning relief, and reducing minimum lot sizes about 2 years ago. And right now, what we're seeing is that prices are going down across Austin. And so it's allowing for, to your point, about more housing being added on, not only single family homes, but multifamily homes and others. And then that way it meets the demand better through prices and through the marketplace versus a government handout or government sort of subsidy like this $200 billion would be. And by the way, I don't think the Federal Reserve should have any mortgage-backed securities on their balance sheet. There was no reason for the Fed to be doing that, if we even have a Fed, which I don't want a Fed. But there's no reason they should have that as mortgage-backed securities on there. And in Congress, or not even Congress, but Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should not dig more into mortgage-backed securities either with these $200 billion.
Now, speaking of banking, really, sorry, Michael, to cut you off here. We're talking about the Fed. You don't like the Fed. We don't like the Fed either. What would be your solution to a Federal Reserve? Since people seem to think that the Federal Reserve protects us from crises, but there's been over 100 crises caused by the Federal Reserve since its implementation. So what would you put in place, preferably?
Yeah, my preference is to move to a free banking system like we had during the middle of the 19th century. And actually, in some cases, before 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was created. You know what's interesting, too, just real quick on this, is that a quick tangent is in 1913, we had the Federal Reserve Act and we put in place the income tax. So it was a situation to where we were adding in a terrible income tax and we were going to monetize it, find a way to cover our other bases at the same year. Another reason why Woodrow Wilson and at that period of time was just a terrible part of American history. And we should go back. We should get rid of all that. But the Federal Reserve, look, I mean, they were created to be a lender of last resort. And instead, they have become a lender of first resort multiple times and distorted our economy and created much more of the boom and bust cycles. You can still have a boom and bust cycle without a central bank, but it won't be as severe and it won't be as long because prices and behaviors in markets will better respond than being artificially distorted by what's happening from our monetary policy and the Fed. And so what I would like to see is, private banks across the country issuing their own currency, and then they can compete with those exchange rates across the country. Now, one or two of those might end up being the dominant one across the marketplace. But what it does is it really starts to incentivize people who have money in their banks to care about what their banks are doing with their money. Today, most people don't care how Wells Fargo or Bank of America, what they're doing with your money, because we have a $250,000 insurance on how much you deposited. And most people don't have $250,000 in their bank. And then you have the Fed, who just comes in and bails out bad banks and bad decisions like the great financial crisis of 2008. And so it makes it even worse. It's all these perverse incentives in place.
Vance, we have a comment that says the Federal Reserve was created to spite J.P. Morgan. Now, my history may be wrong, but I thought J.P. Morgan played a role in the creation of the Federal Reserve. Wasn't he part of the Jekyll Island creation of the Federal Reserve?
I think that's right. Yeah, because the Federal Reserve really got started in 1907. There was a banking panic in 1907, and they put together the Aldrich Commission, right? Yeah. And the Aldrich Commission, part of Congress, was being talked to by J.P. Morgan and others, the banking at that time. So, I mean, they were definitely a part of that. Because if you think about it.
And didn't he bail them out at the time?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So they were all in cahoots at that time, the rent seeking going on and everything else.
But what is the comment to spite J.P. Morgan? I don't understand that, since he was a part of the creation of it.
I don't know. I'm looking it up right now. But
if you could sort that out for us, I'm not unpacking it. I don't get it.
Okay. This is my question now. Trump has talked about appointing somebody as chair of the Federal Reserve that will push down interest rates. This concerns me more than even the tariffs do.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are the chances that will happen? Because he's always talking about Biden's inflation, but meanwhile, he wants more money injected into the economy. Mm-hmm. What's the likely results if he gets his way?
More inflation. And by the way, inflation's not dead right now. It's still running about 3%, which is a full percentage point, 50% higher than the Fed's target inflation rate of 2%, which they never hit. I mean, they haven't hit in years now. And so having this increase in the balance sheet. So just real quick on the Fed's balance sheet, it was $800 billion in 2008 before the financial crisis. That was about 6% of GDP was the Fed's assets. Okay. And mostly treasury debt is what they had on their balance sheet. And then during the great financial crisis, it went up from 800 billion to 4 trillion, right? So a massive increase during that period of time. And then it kind of stuck around there. And then during COVID, it went from 4 trillion to $9 trillion. And now we're at $6.5 trillion. So there's still a lot in there, but that was the quantitative tightening from 9 trillion to 6.5. Well, starting last month, the Fed decided to end quantitative tightening, a reduction in the balance sheet, and move back to quantitative easing, to increasing the balance sheet. So this, along with the lower interest rate sort of push, is going to lead to higher inflation, not lower inflation. And it's a major concern that I have. And so with Trump talking about bringing in that someone who's more of a inflation dove is what we like to call it, where they're okay with having higher inflation and lowering interest rates, I think it's going to be worse for our economy, lead more to booms and bust cycles like we just discussed, and create more inflationary and affordability issues across the country. If you look at the person that he's nominated and was confirmed, Stephen Moran, who's now on the FOMC, the Federal Market Committee. He's one of the board of governors now. He was at CEA, the Council of Economic Advisors, and then Trump nominated him, and now he's over at the Fed. Well, he has been voting against each one of these cuts that they've done over the last few months, because instead of cutting just 25 basis points, he's been wanting 50 basis points or even more. And so my guess is that somebody that Trump will nominate for chair of the Fed, because they have to be approved by the Senate and all that stuff, will be someone who would want lower interest rates. And I'm hopeful that the Senate will push back on that and maybe even vote him down if they need to, because even though Jay Powell, I'm not a huge fan of Jerome Powell, who's the current chair or anything like that. But I think it's important to have some pushback when the president or Congress is telling the central bank what to do. Because, I mean, yes, it's terrible what the Fed has done, but just imagine if politicians were running the Fed, which I guess in some sense they are, because they have to be nominated by a politician, okay? But you get what I'm saying? Like, if it was the president controlling interest rates, I think that would be a worse situation than what we have today. And so I'm hesitant to think about who that he would bring in as being an inflation dove during a period when we already have high inflation.
It seems to me that he thinks those chickens are going to come home to roost after the election cycle. So what we're going to experience is a stimulus, and he thinks that stimulus, the active stock market, people buying things to make the economy look like it's booming, that's what he's going to hang his hat on, and the consequences are going to happen after he's gone. Do you think it'll take that long? I mean, where we're sitting now?
It could. So it could. It could take a little while, because there's lagged effects, right? And some of this won't happen just overnight. For example, if you think about wage growth, and wage growth doesn't lead to inflation, but what we do see is that wage contracts are usually for a year. And so those don't adjust for another year. And other contracts that are being purchased for large ticket items across the United States are also done on a contractual basis. And so it does take some time for the prices to increase. But what I would argue is that you will see those prices go up in other areas. Another thing that Trump really likes to tout is the stock market. And when you put more money into the economy, some of that's going to go in the stock market and boost those returns. So you can say, look, this is looking good, but then we're just waiting for the bust later on.
So somebody in the chat says Trump tries to get rid of a strong dollar. It is very clear. Is that true? Do you think, how is that in his interest to get rid of a strong dollar?
Well, I think that goes back to his trade policy, like we were discussing earlier, right? Of the zero-sum game. So where if we have a stronger dollar, a weaker dollar, then we should be able to export more, because now it's cheaper for foreign folks to buy more of our stuff, and it's more expensive for us to buy imports. And so there is an incentive there to devalue the dollar in some way to help with our trade deficits. And in their view, that would be beneficial to the economy. But what we've seen throughout history is that we've actually performed better when we have a stronger dollar, when inflation is lower. That's really where you have more economic certainty in the economy. And therefore, those orders of production are allowed to be more reflective of the actual prices and supply and demand versus the manipulation by government.
Why do
I just want to say quickly, hold on, Mark.
Yeah,
because
sure.
Diego has been partly vindicated. I looked into this while you guys were talking. And it is true that the Federal Reserve was created to stop another centralization of power like JP Morgan. JP Morgan was not at Jekyll Island. He was heavily represented. He did have two close representatives who played a large role in implementing it. And the law ultimately wasn't passed until after his death. So while I wouldn't say it's accurate to say it was created to spite him, it was created to stop the sort of one-person bailout system. But even with that, he was still represented at the Jekyll Island meeting.
Yeah. That's
So
good. Yeah.
why is it that politicians seem to prefer inflation over deflation? Why are they so afraid of deflation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think even it's not just politicians though, Mark. It's also a lot of economists.
My financial manager says he prefers inflation to deflation. I almost fired him on the spot. I thought that was a scary, scary thing to say.
Yeah. Well, I think people go back to the Great Depression during the 1930s, right? Is that we had what they would call this wage price spiral downward, to where if inflation is going down, so you have deflation. So inflation is going up, deflation. People tend to hold back their purchases of demand, right? Because you want to wait till those prices to go down. And when they wait and the prices go, and that reduces demand today, that could push prices down even faster. And if prices go down faster, then you don't produce as much. And so the economy would tend to contract. That is their argument. But there were a lot more other things that were going on during the Great Depression. Right at the start of it, you had the stock market crash. You had this Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. You had a monetary contraction. There was a lot of bad government policy that was going on that I would not argue that the deflation was the problem. It was the government policy that was the problem. In fact, during the 1800s, so the 19th century, there were periods of deflation and the economy continued to expand.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so I think that this is something that's been in our psyche for so long. We don't want another Great Depression because of the deflation. And those two maybe have been correlated, but they weren't causation. Remember that whole thing?
Yes.
And I think that's really where we're missing it.
So how much of that is due? I'm hoping that I don't get too much into the weeds here, but in monetary history of the United States, and Milton Friedman in general basically talks about up and down, right? He doesn't buy the structural imbalances that the Austrians do. So he talks about that during the Great Depression, the money supply contracted by, I think, a third, and, prices were plummeting and the Federal Reserve failed to act. But they didn't just fail to act. They were actually raising interest rates as the supply of currency was dropping, if my history is correct. But what Friedman missed, I believe it was the Depression of 1873, where prices were dropping, but growth was occurring. And Friedman and Schwartz in the monetary history were confused about this, so much so that in his History of Money and Banking, Murray Rothbard talks about their bemusement because they couldn't understand it. But what he pointed out is that if you actually have a steady monetary unit, and production increases, prices will drop. And that's an okay thing.
Yes. I mean, I think like right now, people are worried about this inflation, rightfully so, right? I've got 3 kids and everything else, it seems like it's going up in prices. And we've seen some reprieve here recently, but I'm still paying a lot more than I was a couple of years ago. It'd be nice to see some deflation because now your real wages can go up. And so what's the better way in an economy that's growing fast, to your point, Michael, is that productivity increases reduce prices. Everything else held constant, that we would have deflationary pressures over time because of the increases in productivity. And what's interesting about it is, I'm sure y'all have seen, and probably some of your viewers have as well, this chart of the century that Mark Perry from American Enterprise Institute puts out, I think every 6 months, where it shows since 2000 what prices have done compared to overall inflation, but for particular items like TVs has went down dramatically since 2000. Other types of areas of technology, phones, stuff like that, things that have more market-based prices have went down because of increases in output, innovation, productivity, right? Whereas the things that have not had high productivity and are dominated by government, like healthcare, education, things like that, we've seen soaring prices well above what our wage growth has been and well above the general level of prices. And I think that goes back to this point, is that what we want is less government involvement in the economy so that people making those decisions allow for the prices to be set in the marketplace and not by government, and not worry about the deflation or inflation, but what's going on in the productive part of our economy.
So we have a comment that I want you to respond to. I think that this to me sounds like a Friedmanite comment. I might be wrong, but that's what it sounds like to me. It says the deflation is much less stable. Stable inflation is norm targeted everywhere in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, deflation, I don't think it's more unstable. I think you have to look at what the period that you're looking at, that deflationary period, was in. For example, the period you just mentioned, 1870s, we had deflationary pressures or deflation in the economy, but the economy continued to expand. However, during the Great Depression, we had deflation, but the economy was contracting. Those are two very different periods. And so then you have to look behind the scenes, what was actually going on. And during the 1800s, 1870s, right, there wasn't a lot of government intervention in the economy. The idea was then is just to let the markets kind of work its way out. And what happened was you had more economic growth. But whereas during the Great Depression, there was continued advancement of intervention by government, whether it be the Fed, whether it be Congress, or even whether it be the president. And collectively, those government interventions led to not only the deflationary pressures on our economy, but also the contraction of economic growth. And when you have less economic growth, that you're going to lead to a lot of other problems. And that's what ended up happening then. So I don't think it's more unstable. I think that part of if you think about a strong economy, one that's unhampered, if you will, by government intervention, what you would see is inflationary periods and deflationary periods. Milton Friedman is one of my favorite economists. So I get where he's coming at on some of this. And a lot of it has to do with the way he explained things. I just think he did a great job on that. But I think the Austrian school, when they look at this and those orders of production that we were talking about previously, I think those just do a much better job in explaining these things and allowing for more economic growth through the marketplace, not through more government.
So we're in the midst of a tech revolution right now. AI is on everybody's lips and on everybody's mind. The government, of course, wants to get involved in it because they believe we're in a competition with China and we have to beat them. This is the new Cold War, I guess. What do you think about AI in general? What it's going to do to the job market world? What it's going to do to productivity? I think it's a revolutionary technology that's great. Of course, has very little downsides. There's always bad things associated with anything that comes into the world, but I think this is an amazing force that can really, really change our lives for the better. What do you think about the government's involvement and engagement with it right now?
I agree with you. I think this AI revolution is extraordinary, and it's going to continue to propel us to more prosperity into the future. There are going to be some downsides to it. Some people will get crowded out of substitution effects where, their job will be taken over by AI. But I think there'll be other jobs that are going to be popping up. Just like when the horse and buggy was going out of business, when the T-model car was coming into place and everybody's pushing back, said, no, we don't want those cars because we need to keep our horse and buggies. Well, a lot of people who are working horse and buggies started working in the auto sector. They just shifted what they were doing. And I think we can't be fearful. I think there's a lot of fear out there about what AI is going to do. And so your point about the politicians, though, is I actually think the Trump administration has been doing a good job in the AI, where they're saying, look, we need AI to continue to expand. And because a couple of reasons. One is because if we're not going to do it, China's going to do it. And so our adversaries are going to go at a faster rate of innovation than we are. And if they have something that's great that we can't defend our own selves, then that puts our national security at risk. And so I think from that perspective, that's been good. But what I've seen is a lot of the state policy. Whether it's in Texas where I live or some other places, there's been this populist sort of rhetoric to where AI is going to take over our lives. It's going to take over the labor force and it's all going to be negative. There's a lot of doom and gloom. And I just don't think that's the case. I think through each revolution, there has been some losses, and I think it's important for us to talk about those. But most of it has been gains to everyone that's part of this process. And I'm excited about the future, but I am concerned about the policies that are trying to be put in place to regulate the inputs to AI and how things are going in, rather than looking at what the outcomes are. And a lot of the outcomes that some people are worried about are already illegal. right? Child pornography and other things. These are already things that are illegal. We don't need a new set of rules for AI. Just follow the rules that are on the books today.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
Now, in California, you wrote that they're actually pushing the AI out of the state.
Yeah.
How are they doing that? What's the policies and what are the problems with them?
Yeah, I mean, there's one AI bill after another that they keep trying to put through, along with the higher taxes, right? They got the highest income tax. They're taxing businesses out the wazoo. It's one thing after another. The regulations across the board, and so a lot of those AI companies have been leaving California and moving to places like Texas, where I live, Florida, Tennessee. Now, all those don't have an income tax, and I think that's part of it. But there's also been more of a less regulatory system, less burdensome regulations in those states, even though I am concerned about the regulations that Texas is putting on, and they were probably going to lose some of those businesses to places like Tennessee and others that aren't doing as much of the regulation. But it also shows the power of federalism, to where if one state's going to do something and another state's not, let's see what works. But with all of that, and this may be something, I don't know if y'all agree or disagree, but there's been this push of the last few months about having a pause, putting a federal moratorium on state AI policy is what it's called. I'm actually in favor of that.
Yeah.
Because I'm so concerned about how the states are trying to overregulate AI, like California, like Colorado, like New York, and some other places, that they're going to stifle the expansion that we could otherwise have. Now, I don't want the federal government to be regulating either. What I'm trying to figure out is how can we rein in the amount of new regulations by these states? Because if California is doing as much regulation as they are, then that reduces the extent of the market that could otherwise be expanding AI and new innovation and technologies that will improve our lives. So that's an area where I think still needs a lot of discussion.
So somebody in the chat here says, is this really true? The AI industry in San Francisco and Silicon Valley still seem to be exploding. Now, but you actually talk about this very thing in your article, that they are still booming, but they're this is what you actually write. California's share of U.S. tech jobs is falling from roughly 19% pre-2020 to closer to 16% in recent years, which is a non-trivial shift for an industry this large. This is a classic example of relative decline. Yep. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. So yes, those places like San Francisco are continuing to grow in their job creation, but not at the same pace that other states are, like Texas and Florida and Tennessee, a lot more at a faster pace. So relatively, they're growing at a faster pace, and that's shifting the extent of the market to other states compared to the Silicon Valley. In fact, in Austin now, there are so many tech jobs that are here. Places are growing, and new businesses new buildings are being built, that they're calling it the Silicon Valley of the South. Is where Texas and Austin is now. And so it's not that those places won't continue to grow like San Francisco, just not as fast as they otherwise could be, and not as fast as many other places are growing, because that's where the businesses are moving to.
Okay, let me just clarify. So the article was specifically about tech. So the Ian Gilmore is correct. He's talking about AI specifically. Yeah. I did make the mistake of saying AI, where the article is about tech in general. So, but what about AI specifically in California? Is that also having a decline, or is that still booming?
It's similar. I mean, Michael, it's difficult sometimes to separate out the tech jobs and the AI jobs. They're kind of all together. Okay. Right. And so it's difficult for me to say, yes, AI is still expanding or not. I think they are expanding, but so you see a similar sort of scenario where even those AI related businesses, which probably are still tech businesses, right, are still moving to other places. And so that's having the same effects. And so that's why I think we're still seeing the differences, because of those relative changes between the states.
So Trump is right in trying to advance AI, but wrong in that he might want to subsidize them in some way. He should just remove restrictions so that AI can continue to progress and innovate.
Yeah. Yeah. And Mark, real quick on that is this whole idea of him taking a share of NVIDIA, one of the main AI companies. I mean, that's industrial policy. That's not where we should be as a quote unquote free market capitalist country, which we're not. But if that's the direction we want to go and what has led us to be as prosperous as we are now, that's not the direction we should be heading, is taking stakes of private companies.
Oh, absolutely. Now, there's a question here in the chat. It's a little bit off topic, but it's something that drives me absolutely crazy. Since I split my time between Europe and America, I live part-time in Paris. I know something. It's my lived experience with the healthcare system over there in Europe. It nevertheless bugs me when I hear people say this. Healthcare has been solved in many Western countries, but U.S. U.S. is corporatistic in healthcare. Nonsense. I mean, nonsense on crack. Can you talk a little bit about this? Plus, some of the successes in healthcare in Europe come from privatizing, by the way, that people don't understand. But talk about this a little bit, because I've experienced firsthand how shitty the healthcare system is in France and in Canada. So that's my firsthand experience. But let's talk about the economics of this and why it's impossible for this to be a true statement.
And Mark, it's not just the quality, right? But you probably had to wait a long time.
I was put in a room with 50 other sick people with an IV in me for 7.5 hours.
Oof. You had it coming. Let's be honest.
And I'm an American who was speaking French. I was telling them I want to go home now, and they were just looking at me like they were going to cannibalize me. It was awful. In Canada, I was fortunate enough, because I'm in productions, I pay cash. I just go to the front of the line and I get the stink eye from everybody else in the waiting room, and the one overworked doctor who's like can't give more than a minute time per patient, who's going out of his mind. So anyway, let's talk about this fucking myth, because it drives me insane.
Tell us how you really feel. No. No, you're exactly right, though. I mean, in Europe, nationalized healthcare and all that, the problem is that nothing is free. And so you're going to pay for it, and you pay for it through lower quality and longer waiting lines. Exactly what you just said. And in America, our problem, the U.S., our problem in healthcare, and I just wrote a book about this called Empower Patients. That's up on Amazon and on my website at vanceginn.com and stuff like that. But with my co-author, Dr. Dean Waldman, and we dive into this. And what we highlight is the problem with the healthcare system is not that it's quote unquote free market, is that it's government. It's dominated by third-party payers. Whether it be the government, which is a lot of it through Medicare and Medicaid, but also through private health insurance. We're being forced, if you're working for an employer, they pay the employer-sponsored health insurance. They get a tax credit for that amount to pay for your premiums to pull you into these other areas. Well, that's forcing you to select into, not even select, but forcing you to go into that private health insurance.
And it makes providers insensitive to the market. There's no incentive for them to bring prices down.
Exactly. So it's not a failure of capitalism or free market healthcare. It's a failure of government. Imagine that.
Also, I just want to give another anecdote. Anecdotes don't necessarily represent the truth overall, but here's my anecdote. I was hospitalized twice in Paris, once at the Socialized medicine place and once at the for-profit American hospital in Paris. That's what it's literally called.
Wow.
The one in the Socialized medicine kept me in there for 8 to 10 hours before I was able to escape. Then I got 3 bills later on, totaling about 400 or 500 euro. I went to the for-profit hospital, the American hospital in Paris. I was served in 10 minutes, got medicated, got diagnosed, saw a doctor, was in and out, paid 300 euro. It ended up being 200 euro cheaper than the Socialized medicine hospital for better treatment and an accurate diagnosis. By the way, when the guy from the the doctor from the Socialized medicine hospital said that I wasn't suffering from atrial fibrillation, I sent the results to my doctor in the United States, who said, yes, you clearly have atrial fibrillation in here. I don't know what the guy was talking about.
Wow.
So I'm sorry, healthcare in Europe sucks, especially if you have a disease that puts you on a waiting list.
But look at this. Is this true? I'm going to look it up.
Okay.
No, that's Cuba. Cuba has a separate system for foreigners. That's how they're able to pretend like they have the best socialized medicine system in the world. No, I was taken to a hospital where there were plenty of French people there. It was a socialized hospital. What was different was that I had to pay for it because I didn't have what they call a carte vitale. So eventually I got billed for it. My wife wouldn't get billed for it because she has a carte vitale, but she'd go to the same fucking hospital.
Yeah. Wow. And you're right about this too, is that in those places, if you have money, you can find care.
There's always a two-tiered system. Always a two-tiered system.
And a lot of them, especially in Canada, what do? They come to America.
Yes. For major procedures, they come to America. And even in the NHS, the vaunted NHS in England, everybody I know who has cash has their own separate insurance and sees their own private doctors.
Yep.
There's a two-tiered system. So essentially what you get with socialized medicine is you price out all the poor people from competitive markets, and they end up having to go to the socialized system where they are, quite frankly, fucked. Yeah. And the rich people end up going into their own systems. And here in America, my doctors are so sick of the insurance companies and all the mandates that make paper shufflers. They're now turning to concierge medicine. So you just pay cash for what you're doing, and you can deal with insurance and companies on your own or not. Up to you.
In America, we spend $5 trillion a year on healthcare, right?
Yes.
And $2.5 trillion is what we find in our work does not go to care. It goes to bureaucracy. It goes to waste. It goes to private health insurance. It goes to everything else except for care. We could cut that cost in half, or almost near half, near 2.5, 3 trillion, right? And still, there's going to be some middlemen. There's going to be some of this stuff going on, but we could save tons of money, meaning lower taxes, and get better care in the process.
Well, this guy says Europe can't offer health care to all immigrants. We have realized that recently. Yes, because
free health care is what he says. Free health care.
Because socialized medicine creates scarcity. You have to ration it out. If a flexible system is a free market system where, of course, healthcare could be more accessible to immigrants who are coming in. It wouldn't be free because nothing is. No. What you mean when you're talking about free medical care is the beneficiary isn't paying for it, but somebody else is. Look, I get 23% of my earnings taken out of my paycheck every time I work in Canada. That goes to pay for somebody else getting born, somebody else's arthroscopic surgery. I've never benefited from that.
Yeah.
Yep. See, this is something that aggravates the hell out of me, guys. It aggravates me everywhere I go and every time I take a position. So we're here talking about how government involvement in the healthcare system is bad. That's the thesis, right? Yeah. Wherever it occurs. So the guy, first of all, wants to justify socialized healthcare throughout. But he makes the claim that France has different systems, which is not true. What they have are different payment systems. So Mark, you wouldn't be covered as a visitor, but you would see the same doctors and all that, same healthcare system.
Correct.
But then he says this, it's US has the highest cost of healthcare by far. But first of all, the initial claim was that Europe has solved, Western countries have solved healthcare. Not that they're cheaper than the United States. That's the first thing. The second thing is nobody's here defending the United States healthcare system. But this is what occurs. If you criticize Donald Trump, for instance, they come in and say, oh, yeah, well, what about Kamala? She sucks.
Yeah. So also, what do you think is going to happen now that Trump is negotiating prices down for pharmaceuticals? Because I feel like what we were doing was taking up the slack for Europe.
Right.
Maybe we weren't, but it feels like we were taking up the slack for Europe. Now I feel like Europe's going to suffer. We're all going to suffer because there's going to be less for R&D. I mean, because these profits have to be made up somehow. It costs $1 billion to send a drug to market for crying out loud.
Well, yeah, actually closer. The average now is $2 billion.
Lovely.
And it takes about 5 to 7 years to get most of them to market, if not longer. But on average, let's say it's 7 years. So it's a long, costly process. And I've actually just wrote a paper on this as well over at Americans for Tax Reform, talking about biopharmaceuticals and price controls, and how if we follow more of these price control models, including Trump RX and the most favored nation sort of rule, where you take the lowest price across the globe and say that's what we're going to charge. Well, research that has been published shows that if you have a 50% reduction in the price, which sounds good, I think we'd all love that, it reduces R&D by up to 30%, meaning that you're going to have fewer drugs that are going to cure cancer, fewer drugs that are going to do something else that's going to help someone else over time, because you're trying to manipulate the prices. Instead, we should understand that we have government failure in the prescription drug market because the FDA takes too long to review things and doesn't approve things. And we as consumers should have the autonomy, the sovereignty to choose what we want to put in our body. As long as we're not affecting anyone else, I live by the non-aggression principle as much as I can. And I don't see a problem with that. If I want to put that in my body, then let me do it.
Absolutely.
And I think that once we can get government out of the way, we'll have a much better healthcare system. And instead, Trump and others keep wanting to put more government to cover up the problem when they're really just going to make the problem worse.
Absolutely. Now, this guy says he's not saying socialism is ideal. He's saying the U.S. is worse. Look, the high prices in America are due in part to socialization, but also in part to American culture that is way different from Finnish culture, my friend. I spend a lot on medical treatment myself because I like being healthy.
Sure.
All right. So I will go to the doctor more often than somebody in Finland for various reasons. For my own health maintenance, it's my own decision. We also are a higher risk culture than other cultures out there. There's a multiplicity of reasons, person from Finland. Socialism is not only not ideal, it sucks. I'm sorry. It sucks. It's a failing proposition all the way around, and you rob yourself of moral agency. You rob yourself of moral agency. Where's your fucking human dignity, my friend? That's where your human dignity
Well, I don't think he's a socialist, the guy.
He's saying socialism. He's not saying socialism is ideal. He's saying, but he's saying it's not ideal. But maybe I'm interpreting it wrong.
Well, no, because you got to look. I'm all for criticizing the guy, but you got to go back here. He says corporatism is worse than the Finnish horrible system. So he's just saying comparatively
that the ugly mix of private and government is a terrible solution.
Yes. This guy's a libertarian. He's from Finland. He's a foreigner. He doesn't know that Mark is crazy. So,
what?
Huh? I didn't say anything. All right, look, we got a couple minutes left, Mark. Are there any questions you want to ask? We got a great economist on. Let's not waste the time arguing with foreigners. What do you got over there?
Okay, so what do you think is going on with Mamdani? What do you think is going to happen to New York? And what do you think this is going to what is going to happen with democratic socialism in general? It seems like the left is going towards that. It's their most consistent moral base. It seems like that's the end of the Democratic Party. That's where they're going to wind up. Do you think this is going to become a wider phenomenon, or do you think eventually people like us, the capitalists, the libertarian thinkers of the world, are going to actually win the day?
I think this is a great opportunity for us to highlight the differences between different types of policies. And what he's put so far or talked about are rent controls, which we know that don't work. And then they have trying to redistribute all these other resources, which is going to make people more dependent on government. And then where do they pay for it? Because they're also talking about putting a billionaire tax and stuff like that, which is going to have them flee. They're already fleeing New York anyway. And you do something like that, more of them are going to move to places like Texas, where I'm at. and so I think this could be another great look. In economics, we don't get clean experiments, right? It's difficult to just take people and put them in a vacuum. You can't do that. But this gives us some institutional experiments. And I think it's going to be a travesty for the people of New York City. I mean, I would love for them to flourish. It's unfortunate, but they voted this guy in. And now they got to deal with the consequences.
Well, as if North Korea and South Korea weren't good enough laboratory experiments, or East Germany and West Germany. Now we're going to have New York, which, folks, doesn't have to remain the financial center of the world. Mamdani could chase them away, and it could go somewhere else. It could go to Florida. It could go to Austin. It could go to anywhere else it pleases. It could go to Singapore, for crying out loud. It could go anywhere where there's a little bit more freedom. Yeah.
Mark, did you hear about Texas opened up its own Texas Stock Exchange?
Lovely.
It's in Dallas, and so they're already starting to have more people on that exchange, and with the idea that many more are going to move out of New York and come to Texas.
They absolutely are. I mean, it's already been happening over the last few years. But we are endorsing a gubernatorial candidate for New York State, Larry Sharp, who we think is an awesome guy. He's a great libertarian thinker. He's got some great ideas for New York. Anybody from New York listening to us, we don't want you to go down with the Titanic of Mamdani. We want you to thrive and succeed under a capitalist system where you are the owner of your own freaking life. How weird is
Absolutely. That? And we all want to thank Mark for funding and financing and opening the stock exchange in Texas, because Mark, that's all Pellegrino money down there. All right, Mark, take us out with the capitalist thought of the day.
Look, what we've been talking about here, folks, is liberty. Human liberty works. Whether you like it or not, whether you're afraid of it or not, it works. Yes, it makes your future a little bit uncertain, but it gives you complete moral agency to realize your potential. That is where human dignity lies, in your ability to choose for yourself how your life is going to go. We think we represent that by promoting a system that respects individual rights. No other party in this country does that. An inviolable right to your own property. That is what the Capitalist Party stands for. That's what capitalism is. It is a economic and political and moral system of complete and total choice across all human action. Michael, what's going to be your question?
My question, and I hope everybody will go to YouTube and answer it, although I got to be honest, most of you don't do this, but we really would like you to. My question is, should I grow back the mustache and beard, or should I go with the clean shave? Please go to YouTube and answer that. Vance, tell them where they can find you.
Hey, man, it's been great having this conversation. We need to do it again soon. There's always good stuff.
You're awesome. I guess you're awesome.
Awesome, man. People can go to me at vanceginn.com. I also post a lot on X, like all the time, whatever's going on at Vance Ginn, easy to find. And check out my newsletter, vanceginn.substack.com, where I post a lot of this information, and my podcast, Let Fuel Prosper show, where you can find anywhere, all that good stuff. So I love this sort of conversation. Look forward to the next time.
Guys,
Awesome.
It's guys like
so
Vance Ginn who are going to keep you from being exploited by the political class. If you read his stuff, you will no longer be fooled by the demagogues. Please read his stuff. All right, so we're going to be here. Well, Michael, is today Friday? Yes. So tomorrow.
Oh my God.
Tomorrow we're going to be doing Self-Made Soul at this time at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about the intersection of philosophy and psychology. It's a good show. I hope you come and join us. You got the whole weekend to check your premises. So if you got any statism in you, get it out of you. Go into a sauna, sweat it out somehow, get it out, come back refreshed, renewed, and ready to take on the world from the capitalist point of view, which means you are your own person. You are the king of your own castle. Until that time, folks, peace.